Hello and welcome to this video on mind-controlled devices, or perhaps more proper to call them brain-computer interfaces. These are things like, say, the Neuralink implant. Now, one prerequisite to all of these devices is that we assume you have a brain, and that brain has either not been destroyed by alcohol, starving some poor unsuspecting brainworm, or something similar. But assuming all of these requirements are met, they enable direct communication between your brain and some sort of external device, or possibly, depending on how you want to listen to conspiracy theorists, the other way around, allowing for some modicum of brain control. Now, this is done, admittedly, using the interpretation of neural signals, and can offer a rather substantial transformation to the quality of life of individuals. But it also has more significant implications in, well, not just medicine, but industry and even consumer applications. We'll start with a fairly comprehensive overview of what the brain-computer interfaces, or BCI, are, then on to the emerging advancements that are there, what the implications become, and whether or not there are any, let's say, current examples that are worth talking about. Your BCI system will take brain activity, and it will convert these into some sort of command for a device. For example, a prosthetic, allowing you to be able to use your hand again. Depending on what you want to use your hand for, you may or may not wish to consider this a bad idea. It can also be used for, say, communication aids, for those who can't verbally speak, but can use some sort of external device. Typically speaking, the process of doing so involves three components. Obviously, you need signal acquisition, because without a signal starting in your brain, you can't do diddly. And then you need signal processing to understand what is actually being communicated, and then output control. Otherwise, you just wind up with a screaming noise that makes no sense to anybody in the case of verbalizations, or possibly just crushing letters in your hand in the case of, say, a prosthetic. The existing technologies do vary notably by how invasive they are, the exact application, and the signal detection method used. Starting with the non-invasive options, these essentially measure brain activity externally and primarily use something like an EEG, or electroencephalography. This is intended to detect electrical signals via some sort of electrode put onto your scalp. These are not exactly the best of methods, but they are widely used due to their very safe profile, the extreme ease of accessibility, and, let's say, a modest efficacy. The EEG-based systems work by capturing the brainwaves, delta, theta, alpha, beta, and gamma, and they associate these with specific cognitive states or motor intentions. This is done with something like, say, a cap or a headset that will record that signal, and that is then used to process it and send that communicated signal to the control devices. This is mostly useful in a medical setting where wearing some sort of bizarre headwear or headgear is not going to be perceived as you trying to stand out, like some sort of Triniboo high school kid. Instead, it's more useful, particularly when we talk about things like, say, motor disabilities. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis is a good example, or controlling wheelchairs. In other cases, you may wish to use it for communication via some sort of spelling interface. For, let's say, more mundane activities, it could theoretically be used for gaming, and there are attempts to do so. Emotive, Epoch, Neurosky, and Mindwave are all intended to allow you to control virtual environments with mental commands. But mostly at this stage, it's either really falling into the category of medical application, or research into things like cognitive states, attention, meditation, and similar. There is, well, as we mentioned, benefit to this in that it is non-invasive. So, without being surgical, having a very low risk, being relatively portable, and reasonably affordable, they have a lot of benefits, but this is tempered against the fact that they have a very low signal resolution. Think of an old television using an analog signal and how static would get in the way of that. They are very much susceptible to noise, for example, muscle artifacts, and they have incredibly limited control precision, mostly because you're trying to read what's going on inside someone's head, not only through their hair, but then through their scalp and the skull itself. All of these are barriers, assuming they have a brain inside their skull to start with. There are, let's say, other non-invasive methods, but these are very much, well, They're basically limited to either research institutes or medical practice. The most common is going to be near-infrared spectroscopy. This is a FNIRS, and what it does is measure blood oxygenation changes in the brain. This is because it has considerably slower response times. You then have magnetoencephalography, or MEG, which basically does something similar, except it's detecting magnetic fields from neural activity. Both of these are highly accurate, but incredibly expensive and are largely confined to things like research labs and hospitals. We then need to move on to what are the invasive approaches, because, honestly speaking, digging inside someone's brain is so much more exciting and interesting than just watching what they do and hoping you get a reading. First of all, BCIs that are surgically implanted typically have electrodes going directly into or sometimes onto the brain. Because of this and the fact that they have now avoided issues to do with your hair, scalp, and skull, have much higher resolution. That is, they can detect much finer signal strength. The first of these is the intracortical electrodes. These are done via something like a mitral electrode arrays. The Utah array is an example of this. And they're implanted into the cortex, that being the outer part of your brain, and they record from individual neurons, or sometimes small groups of neurons, and the signal from that is decoded and allows you to control, say, a robotic limb, or a cursor on a computer. This will allow all those individuals who, prior to now, didn't have access to Pornhub to do so. The applications are to restore motor function. They also, allow for a robotic arm or something similar to be used in lieu of a actual limb, or in some cases, a limb that's just a prosthetic. In terms of clinical research, the studies basically are looking at neural patterns, particularly in things like epilepsy or Parkinson's disease. A brain gate is one of the current options that are out there, and it's used for patients with tetraplegia. It is admittedly somewhat slow at about 8 words per minute, but that is a lot more than they could say before now, and it is very precise. There's also the option to be able to use some sort of prosthetic. BlackRock Neurotech has a similar sort of product, although not there yet, as it's primarily used for research and clinical trials at this point. Both of these have very high signal fidelity. This allows for very precise control and the potential for incredibly complex tasks. This would allow for, say, a degree of freedom prosthetics, which is a rather fancy way of just saying, can you do more than, say, open and close one hand? Could you use 2 hands? Or could you, say, walk more reliably? It is obviously going to have to be considered against the limitations of you are literally implanting something inside of someone's skull, and that does involve surgery. The risk of surgery involves infection, tissue damage, and, well, you have an implant inside your skull now. Electrode degradation over time, and possibly, if not probably, a limited long-term stability, as those electrodes break down and would arguably have to be replaced, and possibly causing some sort of immunological response. Electrocardography, or ECOG, is the next option, and this is where electrodes are placed on the brain's surface, which is arguably slightly safer. The implant is under the dural matter, so they are called subdural grids. Rather than penetrating into the tissue brain, these attempt to provide a balance between how invasive they are and the signal quality. Now, the applications are, as a result, somewhat more limited, but we say somewhat in that they're not quite as advanced. So they can be used in, say, epilepsy monitoring, but also motor control and speech decoding. So they do provide many of the same benefits, but you don't get quite the same, responsiveness. So better signal quality than an EEG, and less invasive than intracortical implants. But you still have surgery to put them in, you still need some, hesitation in how strong or how clear the signal you're expecting to get is, at least by comparison to intracortical methods, but it is better than EEG. And then we have those that are, partially invasive devices. These are placed inside the skull, but they don't penetrate into the brain tissue itself. So, for example, you have something like, say, a stent or an epidural array. So we can start with the simple example of the stentrode. This is given the name, a stent-like device inserted via blood vessels, and it sits near the motor cortex. This allows for the neural signals in that motor cortex to be read, and it doesn't require open brain surgery. It requires slightly different surgery, but it's far less dangerous than opening up someone's skull, mostly. This does allow paralysed patients to, say, for example, control a digital device, texting, browsing, and similar via pure thought function. However, we will point out that this is still relatively early in the, let's say, a life cycle of such devices, with successful human clinical trials on the implanted being reported on in 2023. Versus the other things we mentioned, it is comparatively minimally invasive. It does leverage current techniques used for endovascular treatments and has less but not non-negligible surgical risks. Because of what it does have lower resolution than intracortical implants, and it is pretty much limited to only those parts of the brain that are in proximity to, well, vascular vessels. That is, in this case, obviously where you can put a stent. But that does mean there are parts of the brain where it's just not going to work. The applications of these are, well, we've covered most of them already. You have restoring motor function, communication for things like, say, locked-in syndrome, neurorehabilitation for people with a stroke, spinal cord injury, and similar, and in some cases used to predict seizures for things like epilepsy. There are non-medical applications, for example, gaming, although this is a little more, let's say, specialized as a field and very, very underdeveloped. We then have the military-industrial complex with DARPA funding a lot of this work. What they want is enhanced soldier performance, and in some cases drone control. But then again, DARPA has basically been funding the world's medical research for a long time now. The idea is simply that the fewer dead soldiers there are, the better, because a dead soldier isn't a fighting soldier, and to make a soldier combat-worthy takes a lot of time and money. And then obviously we have research in which you have things like mapping brain activity, or a lack thereof for some people, studying consciousness, and developing neuroprosthetics. There are a handful of, let's say, key players at the moment. Obviously, a Neuralink, as we mentioned at the start of the video, which is intended to develop a high bandwidth invasive implant. Then we have the BrainGate Consortium, which is still trying to look at motor restoration particularly, but could diversify out after that. A Synchron, which is trying to be minimally invasive using the endovascular surgical methods that are available now. Emotive, Neurosky, and Muse, which are looking at consumer-focused EEG-based brain-computer interfaces. And then we have BlackRock Neurotech, which is primarily a supplier of electrode arrays and some BCI systems for research. The challenges we face primarily in these sorts of brain-computer interfaces regard the fact that there is no non-invasive method that doesn't suffer extensively from noise, and oftentimes, because of that, lacks the reliability and precision that the invasive methods have. But, on the other hand, invasive methods, although much, much better in terms of their ability to be higher resolution and more reliable, have problems around electrodes that are used degrading over time. This means longevity is a big problem. This may not be a problem that can be overcome in its entirety either, as although if, and that's the big if here, we could create electrodes that were essentially lifetime worthy, they would still lose efficacy due to scar tissue, and to a lesser extent electrode corrosion, but the scar tissue being the major thing here. We then have ethics issues, and this isn't just ethics issues like, for example, when the Neuralink implant was taken away from one lady after the trial had gone for a period of time, which, given the other things we just mentioned, isn't necessarily an unwarranted decision, but more like privacy concerns, such as being able to read thoughts, informed consent, and, well, to a lesser extent, given what this is, equitable access, given it is a medical procedure. And assuming it's not the United States of America, where healthcare is basically a gamble, the rest of the world will probably offer this reasonably evenly across the board. And then we have user training. One of the big challenges is that most brain-computer interfaces require extensive calibration and user adaptation. And we would argue that based on some other similar kinds of, let's say, research-type treatments, the actual implementation by a surgeon may not be consistent across different surgeons and even different hospitals that are doing it. Therefore, you may get considerably different performance based on who does your surgery and where. If it's not done something like, say, a Neuralink, which has its own robot to do everything. And finally, we have a cost. The invasive systems that exist now are expensive. Incredibly expensive. And we're not talking about buying them as a essentially consumer or patient or somebody who will use it. We mean the actual production. This means that the scalability of the technology is finite and at this stage very much limited. Depending on how emerging technologies go though, it may prove to be more feasible, at least on a larger scale. In terms of emerging brain-computer face technologies, well, we obviously have to overcome current limitations by improving the signal resolution. There's going to have to be a reduction in invasiveness, or at least finding a way to enhance longevity and expanding the applications that it's used for. So we have to start with the advanced invasive brain-computer face such as Neuralinks in one implant. This is intended to be a much smaller device, only the size of a coin, versus considerably larger structures, but it does rely on thousands of flexible thread-light electrodes to record and stimulate neurons across multiple brain regions. It aims for high bandwidth bidirectional communication, which is useful, but it also means that you may need to replace thousands of thread-light electrodes, which not so great. Now, Neuralink has made fairly good progress in terms of FDA approval for human trials and various research, but, well, at this stage, their goals are pretty, let's say, optimistic. First of all, they want to treat neurological disorders like Parkinson's and epilepsy, which, that's a big call. They want to restore sensory and motor function, and possibly eventually enable human-AI symbiosis, which having the Borg is not so cool, but depending on whether or not the AI is in control of the human, we may see humanity destroyed. Innovation-wise, it is far ahead of any other of its competitors, mostly because it relies on robotic implantation for precision, to a lesser extent the wireless data transmission and the biocompatible materials. This does help in many ways, because it mitigates one of those earlier mentioned issues around variation in the medical professionals involved. The challenges, though, relating to that are still the long-term safety, certain ethical concerns about cognitive enhancement, and regulatory hurdles. Next we have next-generation electrodes. Well, should it just be next-generation electrodes rather than next? What they need to do is basically be, ideally, carbon nanotubes and flexible arrays. Researchers are well underway in trying to do this. Mostly they're looking at how to make them softer, more biocompatible, and ideally using things like graphene to minimize tissue damage and extend the implant's lifespan. It's not necessarily going to work out that way, as new materials may be better, alternative materials, or even something more, let's say, biological, creating human cyborg-type creatures. Then we have optogenetics integrated BCIs, which combine electrodes with light-sensitive proteins to stimulate very specific neurons, which allows for relatively high precision, but that development is very much in preclinical stages. But if it goes as intended, a promising target for use. Next we have the fact that you want it to be even less invasive than it is now. Ideally, minimally invasive, but, well, that's not likely to happen. Even if you were to build on Synchron's current stentrode, you're probably not going to find that the alternatives are much better. But if you can expand the applications, possibly seeing more performance from exactly the same implant. Synchron is currently trying to explore the use of wireless power and data transfer to reduce the requirements for external hardware, which would make it less invasive, and arguably more accessible by avoiding things like a craniotomy. But the trials showing that are arguably still quite limited. There are ultrasound-based brain-computer interfaces which would use focused ultrasound-modulated waves to measure neural activity, and this could be done non-invasively, but it can only target very limited and very specific brain regions, and this could be paired with other mechanisms, for example EEG, for bidirectional interfacing. Now, the early research into this shows potential, and it is precise, and it provides non-surgical stimulation, which is great for certain things, pain management, depression, and certainly motor control without implants. But that's still a long ways off getting anywhere. The fact that it's funded and basically done by DARPA is a good sign that we're nowhere near seeing that in the real world. Then we have non-invasive breakthroughs, and particularly high-resolution EEGs. Now, that's one way we could get around issues to do with the lack of, let's be blunt about this, a resolution that's really crappy. You could use something like dry electrodes and AI-driven signal processing, allowing for machine learning to help with that noise reduction, and this would improve EEG accuracy considerably. But, to be blunt about it, having machine learning and getting it to figure out this is what your brain's trying to say, under the best of circumstances, is going to be messy and somewhat haphazard. But it could theoretically, and this is a very theoretical answer, be something that could happen in the very distant future. And especially, it's going to pose challenges with regards to decoding what's going on in real time. It's arguably somewhat more useful, say, with gaming and augmented reality, but it's still probably never going to find its way into use, for example, with medical care or research. Functional MRIs are another option, but, well, that does require a giant donut that makes very disconcerting sounds when you're inside of it. And unfortunately, there is really no way to be able to use MRIs, or in this case fMRIs, to be able to do something very helpful. Because of that, there's the simple fact that they are bulky and expensive means that there is no way to make it happen. Even with the current portable alternatives in development, they're nowhere near actually useful. Transcranial magnetic stimulation might be slightly better, and it has very similar, let's say, prospects to what ultrasounds have, mostly in that it is non-invasive and does allow for stimulation of brain regions using magnetic fields. If you were to pair this with an EEG, you could theoretically get that bidirectional signals. It's useful at the moment and has been used with some success for treating depression and enhancing cognitive performance, but the potential for the brain control interface control systems is, it's not there yet. AI and machine learning is the next obvious thing. We've already mentioned part of this, but to be blunt about it, various companies have been investing very deeply in trying to get a better idea about what goes on in someone's head when they're trying to do certain things. And they're not proving to be that great yet at being able to understand what you're trying to do and separate it from the noise in the background. It's been a little more successful when it comes to prosthetic control, but it hasn't really gotten there yet. There are a few more emerging applications, mostly around the use of prosthetics, or as they're properly called, neuroprosthetics, which is where you have a brain-computer interface trying to restore some sort of functionality. For example, you have vision, where Neuralink has been trying to get their blind sight project going, where it restores, rather obviously, sight. In other cases, you have touch, hearing, and so on. Others are looking at using it for things like memory improvement. There are others that are looking at using it for mental health, for things like, say, depression or PTSD, and to some extent, education and training, wherein, for example, you might zap someone's brain in a certain region when they get a mistake, and therefore they learn don't do the wrong thing. Much like, say, Asian mothers will smack their child if they get anything less than an A. Novel materials are another one we can look at. Things like hydrogels and polymer-based electrodes are arguably the best possible bet at the moment. There are also bioresorbable materials which altogether could reduce inflammation and drastically extend the implant life. Or if this isn't working, or possibly used in conjunction with, wireless brain-computer interfaces. If you have a completely, let's say, sealed implant inside the brain, but that completely sealed implant has a wireless communication to the outside world, it allows for data transfer. It is very much worth pointing out, though, that there are arguably, and this is certainly a big question, ethical and societal concerns, let's call it. There are issues around decoding thoughts, and how that raises concerns about mental privacy. A Big Brother can literally look inside your brain and give you a credit score in social terms. Most emerging brain-computer interfaces don't just need, but will demand incredibly robust encryption and very clear user control. We've mentioned issues around equity, mostly because of the high cost and somewhat limited access, depending on where you are in the world, and certainly what benefits this may have, certainly in terms of, say, cognitive enhancement. Regulation is another worry with, say, the FDA, among other global regulators, considering how they're going to set up a framework for how brain-computer interfaces work, the safety, the efficacy, and monitoring long-term effects. And of course, there's certainly always going to be debate over human augmentation. It's not exactly a fun discussion to be had, unless you're at some sort of Comic-Con where you're debating about which is the best superhuman. Future outlooks for this are, well, not all that great in the short term. We may be lucky to get improved non-invasive brain-computer interfaces for consumer applications. The wider adoption of minimally invasive implants like Stentroid's probably going to happen, but its benefits are handicapped considerably. The FDA is probably going to be approving some of the more invasive brain-computer interfaces for medical use, if they haven't already. Longer term, the next 10 to 20 years, we're probably going to see a much more effective integration, but that integration will primarily focus on things like vision and hearing restoration, possibly brain-computer interfaces looking at things like cognitive enhancement. This will rely heavily on advances in things like AI materials and certainly the wireless technology. The challenges will, however, remain. This is things like scalability, cost reduction, long-term implant reliability, and certainly the ethical framework for, well, not just cognitive privacy, but augmentation as a whole. The brain-computer interface technologies, whether we're talking about something as, let's say, crude and rudimentary as an EEG headset, to the much more invasive implants, have proven so far to be very effective in a medical context and in some consumer applications, but they face considerable limitations in the resolution they provide, certainly how invasive some of the devices are, and the longevity, and the last of these is a big concern. Admittedly, emerging technologies are addressing some of these worries, but what they're addressing doesn't provide a complete answer. Just because you are given, say, new innovations, the shiny new thing does not solve all the issues. Just because your shiny new thing has higher precision doesn't mean it's fixed the underlying problem. The minimal invasiveness is at least getting better, but we're definitely not there yet. But the broader applications pose more hurdles in that you may be able to get a device, but if that device, if it's able to do more things, it means more vulnerabilities. That's not necessarily bad if you are only getting the benefits, but every new thing you can do opens an opportunity for something negative to happen. This is why there remain ethical, technical, and regulatory challenges that need to be overcome before a brain-computer interface can achieve anything near what is described as their full potential. But if they do work as described and hoped, they do stand to essentially redefine how humans and machines interact. But they may also be a spectacular failure. It's hard to say just yet without certainly more development and certainly more evidence of their, let's say, functionality. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.